Tata Steel Masters. First elite over the board chess tournament in months. Nils Grandelius was playing against Pentala Harikrishna. At this point in time, Nils Grandelius had a fantastic start to the tournament with 2 out of 2 points and was leading the entire thing, ahead of Magnus Carlsen among other super duper grandmasters. I am Feedmaster Noam Wittenberg, back with the weekly upload. I stream 4 times a week on Twitch, Tuesday and Thursday, 19 o'clock Central European Time and 11 o'clock Central European Time, Saturday and Sunday. Let's get straight into the video. Nils Grandelius is playing with the white pieces and he goes e4. I checked the database and Nils Grandelius has played the move e4 the most, but he has also played the moves d4 and knight f3 before. e6 is played by Pentala Harikrishna. This is rather interesting, as Pentala Harikrishna has a course on Chessable on how to fry the French defense with the white pieces, so it's interesting that he chooses to play this opening as black. Funnily enough, the openings that he plays the most are e5, the Caracan and Sicilian, and e6 isn't even his main repertoire. Perhaps this is a surprise weapon he has in store for Nils Grandelius. d4 taking the center, d5, and here e5 is played by Nils Grandelius. Both moves, knight d2 and knight c3, are more common nowadays. After knight d2, black has numerous alternatives. One way to play is knight f6, asking white to close the center and then going knight d7. Another option is c5. And here, white's most common move is pawn takes d5, and black has a choice to take on d5 with the e pawn, getting an isolated pawn structure after the d and c pawns are traded off, or taking with the queen, which is a more common option than e takes d. It's possible to even be very adventurous and go h6 in this position, something I've experimented with myself over the board. The position will very likely be closed after white goes e5 and closes in the center, so black has time for such moves. And besides, black has a slightly cool idea here. After knight f3, black can go knight f6, e5, knight e4, and after knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, the knight on f3 is hit by the pawn, and it cannot go to g5, as the square is covered by the h6 pawn. That's one idea of going h6 here. A surprise weapon perhaps you could try. After knight c3, black can choose between going knight f6 in this position or going bishop b4, both decent alternatives. e5, c5, c3, queen b6, putting pressure on the d4 pawn, knight f3 developing and protecting the pawn on d4, and here bishop d7. Black's idea I will show in a few moments. Bishop e2, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, bishop b5. I'd like to mention that to execute this idea is possible a few moves prior. And after bishop e2, go bishop b5 right away. However, this gives white an additional option to play c4 in this position. And after bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, pawn takes c4 is possible, and so is queen b4. Let's start with pawn takes c4. There is d5. Now, if black doesn't take the pawn on d5, white will go d6 and get a very strong passed pawn on d6. So pawn takes d5, queen takes d5. Next, the pawn on c4 will fall. And in this position, even though yes, both sides have 6 pawns, white stands slightly better. White has an additional pawn in the center, namely the e5 pawn. Also, this pawn on e5 is quite far advanced, so it makes black's position a little bit cramped and is like a bone in their throat. Also gives white minuscule attacking chances. Queen b4 is possible, with the idea of after knight d2 pawn takes c4 attempting to hold on to the c4 pawn. However, after a3, queen b5, queen e2, white should be able to regain the c4 pawn with a slight development advantage. So pawn takes d4 is played in the game, and then bishop b5. Here Nils Grandelius castles, bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. Finally, black has executed a very thematic trade-off in the French structure. The bishop on c8 is often a problematic piece for black, as it collides into the pawn chain f7, e6, d5. So it is favorable to trade this piece off. It is also advantageous for black, due to black having less space in the center. The pawns on e6 and d5 versus the pawns on d4 and e5. We see that black has less space in this position. And when you have less space, you have less space to maneuver your pieces. Hence, it's favorable to trade off pieces, so that it's easier for the pieces that are remaining, since they are fewer, to handle less space. Knight c6, knight c3. I'll give you 3.14 seconds to find out why knight takes d4 is not possible by black in this position. Alright, that was something like 3.14 seconds. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and queen b5 check in the end of the variation. And after the king moves, the king is no longer able to castle and is left awkwardly in the center. In addition, white regains the pawn, wrecking black's position. Knight g7, and here Nils Grandelius plays queen d3. Bishop e3 is played more commonly here, but it appears as if the idea with queen d3 is to defend the pawn on d4, and then the bishop on c1 will not be obligated to go to e3 and defend the pawn on d4. It can go to d2 and f4 as well. Rook c8 is played, getting the rook on an open file. Rook d1. h6, this is prophylaxis against the future knight g5 when black will castle. Bishop d2. Knight g6. h4. Bishop b4. Developing a piece, h5, knight g7. The last couple of moves white has invested into moving their h-pawn forwards. As we may observe in this position, white's pawn chain, namely the d4 and e5 pawn, are pointing towards the king side, so this is where white will attempt to generate play. Black, on the other hand, has a pawn chain that is pointing towards the queen side, so this is where black is most likely to play. Knight a4, queen c7, bishop f4, queen a5, attacking the knight on a4, b3, b5, hitting the knight again, knight b2, bishop a3. All good things are free, attacking the knight on b2 once more. Queen e2, defending the knight, and castles. Knight b4 with the idea of rook c2 is an alternative as well. Rook a b1. Now I'll give you 15.4 seconds to try and comprehend what is white's plan with the move rook b1. Okay, the move rook b1, it might look a bit weird at first sight. It's defending the knight on b2, but the knight on b2 is already protected by the queen on e2, so why do we need an additional piece to protect the knight? Well, the idea isn't really to protect the knight, it's to go knight d3 here, then b4 and rook b3, using the fact that the bishop on a3 is close to being cut off. Black replies with rook c7 in this position, in an attempt to double rooks later on with rook fc8. Knight d3, white goes for their plan. Queen b6, now black is ready to meet the plan with a5 here, and that after rook b3 the pawn on b4 is hanging. B takes a, knight takes a5, and in this position white plays bishop c1. This move is very understandable from a human perspective. The bishop on a3 is doing a very good job of taking away the c1 square from the white rooks. Hence, black is able to double the rooks on the c-file without white being able to oppose black. However, this move trades off yet another piece, making white's attack less effective. We have to keep in mind that fundamentally, as previously mentioned, a white's pawn chain is pointing towards the king's side, so white is more inclined to attack than black in this position. And something I'd like to mention, which is fascinating, the strongest move here most likely is knight de1. Prophylaxis, this move is. The idea is that after rook fc8, black will not be able to go rook c2 in this position. Very often the idea behind taking control over an open file is to later infiltrate the opponent on the c2 and c1 square in our case. However, after the move knight knight d e1, the c2 square becomes sufficiently protected, and so is the c1 square. Later, white is going to go g4, knight h4 and g5, and then white also has some play on the king side. In fact, the idea of putting the knight on h4 is that after g4, g5, black will not be able to put a knight on f5 without white going knight takes f5, pawn takes f5. So imagine this, guys. The knight on e7 and knight on f3 is gone. The pawn is on g5, and this e6 pawn has been located to f5. This is favorable for white, because when the pawn is on f5, the d5 pawn is no longer supported by the pawn chain e6, f7, in conjunction to black having a doubled pawn on the king's side, namely the f7 pawn and the f5 pawn. Anyways, bishop c1 was played in the game. Bishop takes c1, rook d takes c1, rook takes c1, knight takes c1, knight c4, putting the knight on an absolutely gorgeous outpost square. Knight b3, rook a8, rook c1, knight c6, with a very cute plan which we will see shortly. Already it's evident that black has a prominent advantage in this position. So many pieces have been traded off here that it's rather difficult for white to organize an attack on the black king. However, black is going to be putting pressure on the a2 pawn in conjunction to the d4 pawn. g3 is played in the game. Unfortunately, it was absolutely necessary to go for the grotesque and passive move rook a1. The idea is purely prophylactic. It's to meet what happened in the game. So rook a3, queen d1, queen a7, queen b1, and now after knight b4, which we would see the exact same theme in the game, there would be knight c5. The idea is that if the pawn on a2 gets taken, so does the pawn on b5. And now in this position, after the two pawns on the queen side have been traded off, both sides are left with a couple of pieces and 5 pawns on the king side, and this position is roughly equal. However, g3 was played by Nils Grandelius, rook a3 and king g2. Now, according to ex-world champion Vladimir Kramnik, g3 in conjunction with king g2 is an improvement to every position. This is an exception, however, since black's idea is so strong that a minuscule improvement to the position doesn't make or break the difference. Queen a7, rook c2, defending the pawn on a2, knight b4. Now this pawn on a2 will be lost, and after that the b5 pawn will become an incredibly strong passed pawn. Rook c3, knight takes a2, rook d3. I'll give you 5 seconds to figure out an easy way to win this as black. Alright, rook takes b3, rook takes b3, knight c1. The idea is that we're forking the queen and rook, and after the queen will go to c2 or d1, doesn't make the difference. We will take the white rook, and now we've traded off a couple of pieces, making the pawn on b5 even stronger. Queen a4, queen b1, b4. The pawn will be pushed to b3, b2, and will later promote. Hence, white resigned in this position. If you made it this far in the video, feel free to subscribe, like and share the video. Maybe even share it with someone. I hope you enjoy the weekly upload, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next Tuesday. See you!